$200, a Super Nintendo setup costs twice as much as the old system. For the money, the company promises better pictures, sound, and adventure. Now you're playing with power, superpower. You're the king, I tell you! The king!
Only for Super NES.
Only on Super NES.
You're listening to the SNES podcast with your host, Soul Blazer.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Super NES Podcast, episode number 155. As always, I'm Greg. He's Joe.
Hello.
Hope everybody's doing okay out there. So we are doing a very special episode this time around. This is the first time we've done anything like this in the history of the podcast. And a little bit different. I kind of debated whether or not even doing this on the podcast, and I also kind of debated whether or not to make it a regular episode. But I kind of figured that, that it would be a fun thing to talk about for a change, a bonus episode, and like, since there is a Super NES that plays a pretty prominent role in one of the in one of the incidents that happened during this whole saga, I kind of felt like it was appropriate to make it a regular episode. So we're doing our first and possibly maybe ever only book review like in this podcast. So we're a little bit late in getting to this. The book's been out for almost a month now at this point. But I had to wait for, obviously I had to read the book and my co-host Joe had to read the book, and
I'm a little slow.
We just had to wait for a regular recording block and all that. So but I did want to, since I was directly connected to these events as well, I also wanted to talk about this anyway. So having an excuse to talk about this on the podcast, I thought was kind of interesting. So the book we're reviewing is a book that actually appeared on Kickstarter 7 months ago for final funding. So the book is called Smoke and Mirrors: The Rise and Fall of a Serial Entrepreneur. Which is a pretty funny tagline. There's an inside joke behind it too, which you kind of will get, but would like to read the book. So the book was written by one Mike James, who lives in Britain, and is probably known to anybody involved in the retro gaming scheme as being one of the original co-founders, co-host of the very popular Retro Gaming Roundup podcast, which has been around for a long time. Actually, the podcast is about 12 years old now at this point, 2009. So it is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, longest running retro gaming podcast out there. So, Retro Gaming Roundup was actually one of the very first podcasts I started listening to when I first started listening to podcasts, period, back 2014. So, like I said, I have a long history like these events. I was kind of connected with them as well behind the scenes, which I'd like to talk about here in a bit. But so anyway. I don't remember how I found out about it, but Mike James basically said, hey, I'm doing a project Kickstarter. I've got a book ready to go. I just need some final funds to protect myself against any possible legal threats, which, having read the book, you understand why. And I think also some of the money was used to hire an editor to give the book a final proofread as well, too. I don't remember for sure if he said that was some of the funds that were going to be used for, but and so he also had stretch goal for actually getting physical copies of the book made as well, paperback, which the stretch goal was shattered because a lot of people were interested in this, obviously. So I backed a tier that got me some nice perks. I got 3 digital copies of the book. So I gave one to my coworker. Coworker. Well, in a sense, you are a coworker, Joe.
I'm a coworker.
Joe here. And I also gave another copy of the book to my friend Ferg, who also introduced me to a whole bunch of gaming podcasts. So I thought it was a nice thing to do. I'm also getting a physical copy of the book eventually at some point, and I also got my name mentioned in the front of the book as well as being a special thanks, which I was not aware about when I got to read the PDF copy. So that was a nice bonus. So anyway, so I gave my copy. So I gave one extra copy to Joe, and I'm like, hey, because like you may remember all this happening way back when. I thought this would be fun to talk about on the show. So the book basically chronicles the whole Clico Chameleon / Retro VGS saga that happened back 2014-2015. By one Mike Kennedy, who two important folks in this saga are named Mike. So oftentimes to separate the two of them, people refer to Mike Kennedy by his online name, SoCal Mike, because of Southern California two also going on. Whereas the other Mike James, the author of the book, likes on UK Mike. So I may use those names occasionally in this episode to help differentiate between the two Mikes, because Mike's a pretty common name. So, but anyway, so anybody involved with the retro gaming community for a while is sure to have heard about this. It was a huge controversy / blow up back when it happened, way back when. So, it's a very interesting story. And this is basically the first time that the whole story has been laid out for us in print. And because he was intimately involved with it, Mike James also was able to put in some insider knowledge behind the scenes stuff that happened with private emails and online discussion, conversation and whatnot. That I always suspected existed, but this is the first time that this stuff has ever seen the light of day. So, it's been very interesting to see how this new knowledge compares to what I already knew about it, or what I thought I knew about it from years ago. So we'll give a quick summary of what happened with this whole fiasco before we talk about the book itself. But let me start off by saying, because I already speak this, by saying and also asking, I teach some insider knowledge. I'll get to that in just a moment. I'd asked Joe back when I first gave him the copy of the book, if you remember this whole saga. So I don't know how much Joe and I have really only connected and talked to one another over the last few years. So I really don't know what you were doing back 2014-2015 as far as your online presence, Joe. You indicated that you were aware about this, but how much you knew about this? What were your thoughts on it at the time, etc. So
obviously, I had heard about the retro VCS and what it could be. As far as all the controversy and everything else, I didn't know this thing. So I'd heard about it. I was excited about it because it sounded like a pretty cool idea. You're going to get a physical console that's going to play games off of a physical cartridge, which, even then, just as much now, people are worried about everything going digital and we're going to start losing games to, servers going down or whatever else. So the physical aspect of it was very interesting and appealing. That was really the last I really heard anything of it until, I want to say, basically the birth of the CU podcast with Pat Contry and Ian Ferguson.
Ah, yes. Mm-hmm. Yep.
That's when I started hearing about it. They were really on top of, I can't really sit there and say that they were breaking news or whatever else, because they were very negative towards the whole thing, and maybe rightfully so. Yeah. Contry's got some history there with Kennedy that apparently there's some bad blood. So at first, I would listen to it, and I would hear his opinions and whatever else, and I would be taken with a grain of salt because it's one man's opinion on what's going on and how much does he really know what's happening. But once literally the wheels started coming off this thing and we found out that it was a Super Nintendo prototype, you know what I mean? And it wasn't what it was promised. I started to really pay attention to, what was happening and whatnot. The book was very insightful. I will say that it definitely filled in a lot of questions I had as far as how this one came to be and how it got off the rails so quickly. Because it was really within three years that they came up with this idea, they promoted it, and then within 3 years, maybe even less, I want to say maybe 2 years, it was just down in the dumps, and people were just dumping on it left and right. So
yeah, no, exactly, because I always knew, being the history major that I am, I'm always eventually when enough time's passed and the dust is settled, somebody's gonna write publish an all-tell book about this whole saga.
Right.
So I did not know. I did not know if that was going to be UK Mike. I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised that's going to be the UK Mike, because really, UK Mike and Scott Schreiber, the other part of the Virtual Gaming Roundup podcast crew. But both of them are very intricately involved with the whole saga. So I figured, so it makes perfect sense if one of them was involved, with this. So
yeah.
But anyway, yeah. So and also the fact that I remember during the peak of it, so much information was flying out so fast from so many different directions. It was a struggle. Staying on top of all of it.
Right.
For sure. But yeah. So as I joked about before in the past, there were some good things. There were some good things that came of this whole mess. One of them being I discovered a whole bunch of very good podcasts and YouTube shows.
Right.
because their coverage of this, including the CU podcast.
Yep.
So
exactly.
And that's the stuff I listen to these days. So it's yay for that. So but anyway, yeah. So I mentioned before that I don't want to overplay anything. It's I was present during this time period. I was active. But most of my work was just kind of behind the scenes of stuff. I was helping people with things, but yeah, nothing very important enough to to get mentioned, which. I actually would not have been shocked if my name got mentioned in the book at some point, because everybody's name got mentioned in the book at some point, seems like.
Right.
But there were a lot of names dropped in the book, so which we're about here in a little bit. But anyway, so but the book itself is kind of roughly divided into 3 parts, as Joe alluded to already. You kind of have the before, in which several chapters are devoted talking about Mike Kennedy himself as a person. Where he came from, his business ventures, that kind of stuff. It's then you also have the whole saga itself of the retro gaming VGS, which more to the Chameleon, and then you have the final part, the fallout, from all of this. So, but anyway, yeah. So, I kind of liked how the book started, because it's a lot of people who read the book are going to already know at least some information as to what happened in this whole saga. But UK Mike tried to write the book in a way that a lay person, as somebody who knew nothing about this whatsoever, could come in, pick the book up, read it, and understand what happened. So and talking about Mike Kennedy and where he came from is important, I think, for several reasons. Because one, it provides that background that somebody coming to the book may not have. 2, it explains Mike's motivations, how he came to be involved in the scene, some of his driving ventures, what the seed was behind him wanting to do this project in the first place.
Right.
And 3, it also drives home the point, which I think UK Mike does an excellent job with, about talking about that Mike used to be a very good person before all this happened. It's
yes.
it's seen. one of the biggest ongoing debates even to this day is still like, when did he change? When did this whole mindset change from being legitimate, if possibly misguided venture to introduce a new retro game console, to becoming an outright scam? Right. It's like that's still debated today as to when it happened, what point, how much he knew, that kind of stuff. Because even now, at your most generous, you could say that things snowballed out of control for him more than you expected.
Right.
At the most generous, you could say that. At the worst, you could say he was an outright scammer like from his get-go. So,
right.
People, and like I said, people still debate to this day when that change happened, because, and you can decide for yourself upon reading the book what your opinion of it is. I have one. I'm sure Joe has one too.
Yeah.
But anyway, I think it's very important that that UK Mike does lay the foundation for all this, because I thought he did a great job in explaining also, how because he, Mike Kennedy, and Scott Schreiber were for a long time the three main guys on Retro Gaming Roundup, the podcast, and they did all the work behind it. And it's like, like I said, I started listening to the podcast back in 2014 before all this started happening, and I really loved the podcast. I thought I thought the three hosts had great chemistry. I thought they had a really fun time talking about things, shooting the crap, whatever, talking about stuff. They're very long podcasts, very meaty podcasts. So, I would not always listen to the whole podcast. Sometimes I'd jump around from part to part to listen about the stuff I was most interested in. But my favorite section, the part I was listening to, was top 10 debates, because Joe, how cantankerous top 10 debates are, because it's like anytime you try to debate, hey, top 10 best Star Wars figures or whatever, it's like
right.
Nobody's gonna agree on that. So top 10 lists by themselves are cannon fodder for good debate. So so it was a really fun, enjoyable podcast to come from, because all three guys came from different walks of life, different parts of the world, different mindset, different opinions on things, whatever. So, I actually found myself agreeing with Mike Kennedy a lot of the time as far as viewpoints on games and whatnot, because often when it came down to debate or discussion or whatever, I'd be like, I think he made the most sense on that one or whatever.
Right.
So I also signed up for the Retro Gaming Roundup forums at the time, and also the Game Gravo web forum, which was run by Mike Kennedy at the time, because Mike Kennedy was hosting that stuff. So I had some issues. Signing up. So I used to send him an email, and I actually did check it. Actually did look before we hopped on the podcast today, because I still have a record in my Yahoo folder of all my sent emails. So I still have a copy of the emails that went out to him in May 2014, where asked for help. And also, while I had his ear, so to say, I also told him, hey, love your work, love the podcast, blah blah blah, gave him some good feedback. So we had a few emails back and forth to help me out with the issues. I thought Mike was very friendly. He was very polite, very, very helpful. He was very quick to get back to me, in responses. All around my email correspondence with him seemed to just confirm the positive indication I already had from listening to the podcast, because I'm sure Joe, that like anything else, somebody may paint a picture of themselves in a podcast or a TV show or a YouTube channel or whatever that may be totally different than how they are in real life.
Right.
But
exactly.
I did not get that impression with Mike Kennedy based upon those email conversations. Now, granted, I was never as close with him as Scott and UK Mike were. I'm just saying, based upon those conversations, those just reinforced the positive views I had about him at the time. So, I even joined him. So I even joined him on a podcast. Short time afterwards. So Do you remember the ColecoVision podcast that Willie used to do? Joe, did you ever listen to that?
I listened to it, but I don't remember too much from those podcasts, to be honest. I know he did.
Yeah.
He did some with Ferg, I think. I may be wrong.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So, like, that was kind of my introduction, and I think it was... I want to say it was after this whole fiasco in which I was introduced to that podcast, and I'm horrible at going back into the backlog.
Yeah, so anyway... Yes. Anyway, like, Willie and Mike, SoCal Mike, originally created the podcast together. They were the original, they were the two hosts. But but they had like guest hosts on. So like and when they announced the episode coming up on the ColecoVision ports of Gyros and Time Pilot, which two of my those two games are two of my all-time favorite arcade games. I asked Willie if I could join them on the podcast, talk about the tech of those games, because I love them so much. Right. So, and Willie always been a great guy, always has been a great guy. Was kind of let me on. So the three of us, did the podcast together. So, so obviously we talked a bit before the podcast, and again, the impression I had about Mike from the podcast, like, very positive. Like just a very friendly, knowledgeable, warm, all-around guy. Who really liked me, who really enjoyed what he was talking about, was passionate about it. And there was a and I could see, he's a salesperson. He's a salesperson, like, by nature, by nature and job. It's like salespeople, have certain. You have to have certain personality type, like, to be a good salesperson, because
absolutely.
You got to be warm, friendly, outgoing, and so that made it easier. But again, he was very engaging, very friendly on the podcast, whatnot. I remember him saying he liked one of my descriptions I came up with on the fly when I called the Time Pilot port of, on the ColecoVision. It looked like being constipated because of how sluggish it played, and it's like, so he really enjoyed that. So so again, so that was pretty much the extent of my interaction with him back in those days. And this is shortly, and this was before the start of the Retro VGS. This is when he was starting to get the idea of the Retro VGS going, but before he actually had publicly come out and said anything about it yet. So, he had Game Grab going, he had his other side ventures going. So, but yeah, so like I said before, he's a salesperson by nature. So, by nature, he was a very outgoing, like, salesy type of person who could really like selling something, which is why I think he was so successful. One of the reasons he was so successful in helping to sell this vision that he had of this new console to so many people. So,
and this is actually a prime example of how well the book conveys the description of Mike Kennedy. You've had this personal experience with him, and you're able to explain how your interactions were and how they, were reflected and whatever else. And I had no interaction with Mike Kennedy, but yet through the book, for one, you could tell UK Mike obviously was friends with him. It comes from a very genuine place. Like, you can tell it is someone who is writing about a friend who has strayed off the path very slowly. Like, so slowly that at some point you feel like UK Mike probably could have grabbed him by the arm and kind of put him back on the right path. But because it was such a gradual thing, like, nobody saw it. You know what I mean? Until it was too late. But it comes off as a guy who's, he's an idea guy. He, has all these great ventures that he wants to take part in, especially with Game Gavel and whatever else. It just seemed like he just couldn't, based on the writings, like, he just couldn't stick to it. And I can relate to that. Like, that was the first thing I thought of when I was reading this. Like, I'm like, oh man, like, with a little bit of money, I could be. I'm sorry, I could be Mike Kennedy because I am horrible at sticking to my commitments. Granted, I had my own podcast for a while, but doing the recordings, doing the editing, and all that stuff, like eventually it took its toll, and it's not dead yet, but it's like one of those things, like it's not priority for me, and that's what makes this podcast great, because I can do. I won't say the minimal work, but you know what I mean. Like I can, you know what I mean. I don't have to do as much. I don't have to worry about editing. I can show up. We can chit chat about whatever the subject is, and it's all good. Like it's out of my hands after I hit stop. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Which is a wonderful thing, and I think like Kennedy could fit very well into something like that if he had someone who could direct him. He's just on his own. He was a loose cannon, you know what I mean?
Oh yeah, totally agree.
Yeah. And then like I said, when I'm reading it, I'm sitting there the entire time going, man, like if I had just a little bit of money, I could totally see like me doing something like this, trying to start something, taking over Game Gavel, which is a great idea. You know what I mean? It was a great idea. It was great for him to invest in. But at the same time, it just seemed like at some point he was just like, oh, okay, well, this is doing its thing. I'm just going to walk away from it and see what happens. And he expected magic to just, boom, happen. And it was going to blow up and be this thing. And it was going to be like the eBay of retro gaming. And it just didn't do that because he didn't apply himself to it, and it fell apart.
Yeah, those are great points. Points, and those are points I was actually going to bring up. Bring up myself. And the book does a great job of explaining this. The book does a great job of talking about this as well. Also because the book makes the book says the same thing. It's like Mike Kennedy was being a salesperson. He's a salesperson. He was he's trained for, and he's an excellent idea guy.
Right.
And there's nothing wrong with it, and there's nothing wrong with an idea guy. Every good company has an idea person like on their team. Because somebody has to actually come up with the idea, and that's like hey, could we do this, or what about this, or whatever. So nothing wrong. So there's nothing wrong with having an idea person with you because that person's needed.
Right.
The problem is the idea person needs somebody else to hand the actual idea off to see if to see if it's viable or not.
Yeah, the idea guy needs a filter.
Right, but and he also needs somebody to rein him in when it comes time to be like okay, we need to actually finish this.
Right.
I believe it was Henry Ford who once said there comes a time like every project when you have to shoot the engineer and get the stuff on the road or something like that.
Right.
Where it's like you can't R&D something or develop something forever. And eventually, at some point, you have to call it done and ship it. So, and Mike Kennedy also had the problem. They also had another problem, kind of related to him being an idea guy, but not always. Where it's like once he had the idea, it couldn't hold his interest. And again, there are people I know in real life who are like this. They come up with a great idea. For a while, they're all gung-ho on it. They're all like, yeah, let's do this, let's get it done, let's make it happen, whatever. So, and then once the idea is going, regardless of what state the idea is actually at that point, once it gets up and running, to some degree, they lose their, it loses their interest, and they go on something else. But they're always on to the next, biggest thing. Again, if you're in a company with a team behind you, the team can then take over and support the idea at that point. That's fine. I mean, basically that's really how Apple got to where it is today with Steve Jobs.
Right.
But because Steve Jobs was never really an engineer, he was always like an engineer guy. So, but he had the people around him to make this happen. So, but Mike Kennedy, for whatever reason, didn't. And again, I think the book again does a great job. In the first part by trying to explain how is as a person, his personality, or whatever, and helping you decide, how much of this fault is actually squarely on him, because obviously
Right.
some of the fault is on him, but it's like
Right.
like is the problem because he didn't have people to hand it off to, or is the problem because it's a bad year to begin with? But maybe some of both. So it's up to it's up to the reader to decide what they want to do with it. But so the second part of the book, the middle part of the book, when he gets to the whole Retro VGS / Clear Chameleon saga, because what happens then? It happens then at that point. You can directly tie into Mike's personality and how his brain works.
Right.
So, the first part of the book is tedious. It is the slowest part of the book, I think. It is a slog. So it is a slog to get through. I will say that about it. So, the book gets much more interesting in the second part. After all that stuff is done and it'll explain it for you. But yeah, I think that is. But yeah, I think. So I think overall those first several chapters are kind of like the worst. Not because they're badly written, just because of the fact that it's slow, it's tedious in places. But I know it's kind of like with learning how to fly. The actual education process is not fun, but once you actually sit in the cockpit of a plane and know how to fly, it's great. So. This is this is kind of the same way, in the sense that you need this background knowledge to really be able to figure out and understand everything everything that's about to happen. I think you agree. So I think what you were saying. Joe, I think of what you're saying off mic that you agreed with me about that first part of the book kind of being like tedious.
Yeah.
But interesting, but tedious.
Yeah, it was very detailed, which is one of the things that I have to give credit to the book, is it's very detailed. It really fleshes out everything so that you understand before you're moving on. It's just sometimes just a little too detailed.
Sure. Yeah, right. So,
like I had explained it to you, it felt like an info drop. Like everything was like, oh, here's the chapter, info drop, which is okay sometimes, but it felt like it just continued to do that, and at some point it was just like, okay, can we kind of move on? That's how I felt, and it's, that's just my personal opinion,
right?
As far as that first little bit, especially.
But the most critical chapter, though, I thought was a chapter which Mike, as you mentioned before, Joe, he goes into agonizing detail about trying to explain how. How he, SoCal, Mike, and Scott are all friends. It's
right.
That one chapter is talking about some of the shenanigans that happen. Some of the shenanigans that happened in the past, some of the pranks they pull on each other.
Right.
Those are all indicative just how close their friendship was. So
right.
exactly. And so if they were not friends, they would not have given him even a micro as much slack as they did when this whole saga started happening.
Right.
So, but yeah, just really, it's interesting. It's interesting. It's also sad at the same time, because it's it's like you can see as you read through this. Yeah, the seeds were already there from Mike's downfall, but the actual process of how it happened is very interesting. And again, like I said before, it's debatable even to this day as to when exactly everything started falling apart, and when it crossed from being an idea category into scam category. So
yeah. Which I think I have an idea of when that really started.
Which will, yes, exactly. I do too. So we'll save that for your closing thoughts. But so. I mean, Scott makes a great point, in the book when he's quoted by UK Mike and saying, that he initially told SoCal Mike when he came up with the idea for the console, he's like, I'd buy it, but I really don't think there's a market for it. And so, if he'd listened to him, maybe this might have been different. But the problem is that that once and again, the book does a great job of explaining this. Once Mike gets an idea in his teeth, he's very determined to make it happen. So it's I think it was. I don't remember who said this. I want to say it was probably Pat Conti, who said the Retro VGS was a problem looking for a solution. In the sense that it's a retro themed console, yes, but who's it for? What market is it serving? Because the limitations of it. Even the time I started hearing about it, I was like, okay, this is like a niche product at best, because it's like cartridges. There's a reason games aren't using cartridges anymore these days, folks.
Right.
But it's purely right from the start, I'm like right from the start. Obviously at first I didn't think it was a scam. I thought it was gonna happen, but I'm like, no, this is not for me, because it's like, this is purely a nostalgia-based project process, and like being aimed at collectors with all these like these custom shells, limited serial numbers, and cars and whatever that only collectors are going to care about. His heart was in the right place, but the actual reality of this was never going to take off. But because back then I was also back then during this time period I was also like a very active user on the Atari Age forums, which is the best place on the internet even to this day to talk about like Atari related matters.
Right.
But not just like Atari stuff on there. They also talk about other stuff as well too. I'm still active on Atari Age. I'm just not active on there as much as I'm just not active on there as much as I used to be because real life has gotten in the way. But yeah, so Cal Mike was a pretty active post on Atari Age as well too, and this is where he first started pitching the idea. Hey, we're gonna do a fundraiser, a crowdfunding for this. We're gonna do this. We're gonna do that. He's already getting feedback and ideas on it, and I weighed in that discussion myself. I made some posts because, like I said before, I knew Mike. I wasn't close to him like other people were, but like I said before, we had podcasted together before, so I weighed in on the conversations before, on these conversations before. Those triggered some super long threads in Atari Age too. I'm going like pages and pages and pages of other stuff. But during the peak of all this happening, February 2016, when the whole when the whole 3 scams business started happening, I would literally for a good month come home and literally eat dinner and try to catch up on the thread, which would take like a couple hours because that's how much content was being posted there every day. It was it was insane. It was crazy. It's crazy how much stuff was posted there that fast, that furious. So, but anyway, yeah. So, the guy who runs the Atari Age forum, Albert, also commonly known as Al. He's also a great guy. So, he was also very active like I was going on because he gets mentioned quite a few places in the book as well too. So, yeah. But anyway, so I knew from the start that this wasn't for me. But really, as I mentioned before, there was like three. There's really 2 phases of the project. Because it's important to separate, I think, the retro VGS from the retro VGS like the Coleco Chameleon, because I would argue, and I'm not sure if you feel the same way I do, Joe, but I would argue that the retro VGS project was totally legitimate, real in its conceptual design and idea, and what Mike wanted to do, some of the thoughts for it, and whatnot. It wasn't until it started it wasn't until the project came back and rebranded as the Coleco Chameleon that things started crossing scam territory. So, so that's how I feel. Like I said before, we can talk about the actual point of what we think is the point toward the end, but I don't think I'm putting words in my mouth. I don't think I'm putting words in your mouth. Like by saying that. However,
no, I 100% agree.
But the problem was, and this is apparent even during the Atari Age days, 2014, that Mike was again being an idea guy, but not giving the engineers a chance to do the work, because it's like, okay, because he was just exploiting people to get the knowledge and information he could from one person, and then running on to the next person, without really giving anybody the proper time, the proper money, or the proper support they needed to actually make this happen, because. Right. Because like Mike had an idea in mind, like what he wanted to do, but when people came up with him like the concepts, he rejected them as being like too expensive. So, And also, I remember Mike making a, you remember in those days Mike making a huge deal over the fact, for example, though, for example, that he bought the modes like from the Atari Jaguar to house the new system in, and it's like as the book makes the great point that actually was a liability because most systems are designed even to this day by having the idea first, the actual hardware, then design the system around it. Because when you try to shoehorn a system into a shell, you run into problems.
Right.
Microsoft tried that with the Xbox 360, and look what happened to them.
Yeah.
So, and again, that really hurt, and again, that really ended up being a liability for the retro VGS because in order to get the stuff and the stuff he wanted in the console that size was going to increase the price, and the price eventually went too high to the point where Mike's like, no, I can't do it for that price. Like, let's do what we can. We're just like, so it's like. There's definitely a lot of comparisons between this and the recently launched Atari VCS, but because the two systems definitely have a lot in common.
Yeah.
But at least in the Atari VCS case, they didn't design the shell first.
Right.
But anyway, yeah. So and then. Like then the Kickstarter launched. I'm sorry. No, he wanted to do Kickstarter, but he found out at the last second he couldn't do Kickstarter because the prototype required for Kickstarter.
Right.
Which he didn't have a prototype. And then he launched it in Indiegogo, and I'm reading that going like, he wants $2 million for this? Seriously? Mm-hmm. It's like that was like that. That's when I knew he lost all touch of reality because it's like. Even that point, so even that point, I'm still like, okay, he's gonna eventually realize his mistakes, pull this down, relaunch it again, whatever. So, which did eventually happen in some way, shape, or form. Right. But yeah, it's like, but yeah, it's like, but the total lack of prototype really killed most of the interest, especially in Atari age. Where the collectors might have had for it, because it's like it looked like he was trying to do smoke and mirrors, to use the use the title of the book, to create the idea of the project, to get the funding in, then use that funding to actually like create the prototype. It's like right. it's like anytime that happens, inevitably problems develop, serious problems, because Indiegogo, there's a solid reason why Kickstarter requires a prototype, because anytime Indiegogo is something like this, the project eventually either doesn't come out at all, or comes out years later, comes out way over budget or whatever. So it's like there's a good reason why Kickstarter does this whole prototype requirement in place. So it's like I was not shocked. I was not shocked that Mike Kennedy realized his mistakes and pulled away with his tail between his legs. And it's like at that point. At that point, I'm like, okay, he made a mistake, sure, but he'll come back stronger, stronger with this like next time, like a better idea. So, yeah. So what happened next, though, kind of got very interesting, to say the least. So Coleco. We probably should mention here real quick. Coleco, as itself, of course, no longer exists as a company. They went bankrupt around like 1988. I'm sorry, not that early. 1991, I think, is when they when they bankrupt. Coleco is best known for putting out the ColecoVision console, like in the early 80s. They're also very famous for making Cabbage Patch Kids, which kept the company going for like a while. So. But eventually, bad business decisions in the changing market could cause them to file for bankruptcy. Coleco still exists as a shell company these days. They're Coleco Holdings. Mm-hmm. But basically, as a shell company, they're just basically responsible just for like licensing out the name and the likeness to anybody who wants to use them. For example, and Sega does the same thing too these days a lot. I mean, Sega's still around as a company and not as a shell company that Coleco is. but both companies make a lot of money by licensing their name to stick on like games, plugins, keychains, whatever, what have you. So, and this is no different. So Mike thought that for his new version of the product, he could get increased exposure by licensing the name from Coleco Holdings to call the relaunch console the Coleco Chameleon. The Chameleon being a reference to the fact that he wanted to include a custom graphical chip with it that could change the emulation on the fly. So, but anyway, yeah. So the new system came out. The idea of the system came out, and I was cautiously optimistic about it because I'm like, okay, this sounds pretty cool. So, but because they and then you have the whole three fiascos come out, which all happened in a very short period of time. So, we had like the three fakes exposed one after the other. So, you had the fake one you had was the whole, infamous like John Carlson a table video we posted on YouTube showing like a supposed prototype of the system in operation that was proven to be a fake.
Right.
Then you had the whole Toy Fair incident, the Toy Fair incident with Super NES Mini, running in the Jaguar shell as fake number 2, and then finally had the capture card being passed off as prototype as fake number 3. Right. So how much did you remember hearing about all this? All this was actually happening back in the day, Joe.
The big one that obviously I heard about was the New York Toy Fair and the Super Nintendo being hidden in the shell, and the big thing was before we found out that it was a Super Nintendo in the shell was that it was there at the Toy Fair, and people were asking to basically see the insides, see the back of the system, things like that, and basically were being stonewalled. And that right there started, I want to say it was like on a Friday they started, maybe. It was either way. It was like one day within like a 6-hour frame period in which the thing hit the floor. They were trying to do their presentation or showing it off, and questions were starting to be asked. They were being stonewalled, and the next thing you knew, the internet was blowing up about this thing. And then within 24 hours, someone was like, "Oh, here's pictures of it inside the hotel room. It's clearly a Super Nintendo," and it just blew my mind.
Well, Mike actually did show the back of the system in one picture, which is a big mistake on his part because it showed the black tape covering up tape covering up the back of the system. It's like, okay, that's a red flag. But yeah, so that Atari H forum thread I mentioned before already had been busy. It definitely exploded because of this. So because the first fake, the John Carlson fake, I'm like, okay, I can give you them. Because me, like a lot of people, I want to give Mike the benefit of the doubt, because I'm like, because I knew the guy, not as well as other people knew him, but I knew how he was. So I want to give the benefit of the doubt. So after the first fake, the John Carlson video, I'm like, okay, that was badly handled, but yeah, I mean, it happens. So we'll see what happens after this point. So because about the same time also they were supposed to go live on Kickstarter with their crowdfunder as well too. Right. And I remember this, I remember this clearly because the launch date for that was my birthday, February 26th. So I remember sitting at home that day because I took the day off of work, because many people do their birthdays. Yeah. And I'm like, so I'm refreshing the page every minute, going is it live yet? Is it live yet? So so I cracked a few jokes about how I was actually gonna play games that trying something that actually existed. So
right.
And whatnot. So that second prototype, the Super NES Mini, it's like there are just too many there were just too many red flags. But by the end of the day, I was convinced that it was a fake, and I'm like, and then of course Mike Kennedy tried to explain himself afterwards, and this is still like what I mentioned before. It's like, even at the best generous interpretation of these facts, he was still an idiot.
Right.
Like not. Not for doing what you did, and that's the best possible interpretation of the facts.
Yeah.
But so it's like at that point, I'm just like, I pretty much had lost all my faith. My faith in him at that point.
Yeah, I'm sure you're not the only one.
So. He did have defenders. Like Willie, for example, was still was still a defender of him at that point. But any remaining shred of doubt I had, it was blown away. Was blown away like the third fake, because it's like, it's like when the pictures got posted on Facebook and got shared on Atari Age, everybody's like, because of what happened previously, everybody's like, okay, let's scour the internet, let's see if we can find this card.
Right.
And so I'm like, I started helping out with that process a little bit behind the scenes, but then I'm like, there are probably hundreds, if not thousands of people out there right now doing the exact same thing I am.
Yeah.
They don't need my help, but so I'm like, so I stopped. So it's like, because and as the book points out, it did not take very long for two people, including Albert, the founder of the site himself, to find out what it actually was, the capture card. And it's like, okay, that's it, because it's like, as Pat Conti famously said, it is, and his book reproduces a quote. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Fool me three times, F you for. Like forever. So
Yep.
Which is like, okay, that's my thoughts exactly at this point. So
I mean, to be fair, the book kind of points out that it actually kind of makes John Carlson a very sympathetic person.
For sure. So
he was trying to work with this idea that was ever changing. You know what I mean? So to have a prototype was, in honesty, like virtually impossible. There was never going to be a prototype, because the idea of what Kennedy wanted to do kept changing.
Right.
So,
yeah.
I mean, like, I get the first video with the with the fake prototype and whatever. You're just kind of, you want something there so this way you can get it on Kickstarter. I understand that. I won't even sit there and say that he was trying to scam anybody at that point. But definitely by the time the third one, like, that's full scam mode. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yep. But, yeah, exactly. And like, the book also points out, I did not realize that there were 4 engineers who were involved in the project at one point. Mm-hmm. It's like, even though I knew a lot about the saga, one of the great things about the book to me was finding out behind the scenes stuff, because like, because UK Mike was published a treasure trove of like private emails, conversations, discussions behind the scenes. It's like, it really had to fill in the I really had to fill in the pieces like what happened. Mm-hmm. So it's like, like for readers and see how it all came together. So it's like, so a lot of people came off as being sympathetic, like in the book, because of what happened. It's like, I wish I had more coverage on some other people in the book who for various reasons could not happen, because it's like, because I mentioned before, there's a lot of names dropped in this book. It's like, I think maybe one of the criticisms I have of the book is that maybe perhaps there's like too many people like being named. I even had a hard time keeping it straight. And I knew or know most people who mentioned in the book because of my time online like the podcast and whatnot. An index in the back, kind of saying like a who's who, like people who mentioned the book would have been like very helpful, because I think a layperson picking this book up the first time is gonna be like, okay, who is this? What's this person's involvement again? Et cetera, et cetera. So That's one of the criticisms I have that I have in the book. Mm-hmm. It can't really be helped because a lot of people were involved in this project during its life, but still, I think it could have been organized like a bit better. So
yeah.
I wish that what's his name? I'm drawing. Like Steve Awida. I wish Steve Awida had consented to be an interview for the book because Steve was one of the three people initially involved the project back in the retro VGS days. Him, Mike Kennedy, and John Carlson, because he was a software guy. He's a programmer.
Right.
He programmed a lot of the great 2600 games. So, Steve mentioned, so UK Mike mentioned the book that Steve mentioned he wished the book had never come out. I don't blame Steve for being embarrassed about this whole thing. I'm sure he probably looks back at it now going like, what the hell is all this about? But
right.
So I don't blame him for being embarrassed. That said, I wish he had like given his side of the story because to be think that's one that's one person I very much would have like have heard more of.
Yeah.
I also wish that Sean Robinson had not backed out in his initial agreement to be involved in the book because he's also a very interesting figure too. Because it's like it's still debatable at this point how much that Sean was involved in all this. How much scamming did Sean do? Because we really don't know even to this day.
Right. And I feel like he's the catalyst. You know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah, so like. When we were talking about, where we think it became a scam and where it didn't, I would say Sean Robertson's involvement because of his current situation, being in jail for the Ponzi scheme and whatever else, kind of leads towards him. But then, it doesn't clarify. That was one of the questions that really gets left unanswered in this book is, when did Sean Robertson get involved and what was his involvement, completely? We get bits and pieces, but we don't get an exact answer.
Probably because, he never said. Right. That's why I said, because UK Mike mentioned the book that initially Sean was supportive of the book and agreed to be interviewed for them, but then UK Mike asked him some questions, and of course they're going to be hard questions because it's like, dude, you were directly involved in the center of this. Like, what do you expect? Like a fluff piece? You're not getting it. So obviously, when he got presented those hard questions, he backed out. Right. So, which is unfortunate, but and then again, also the third person I wish we could heard from, but I know we're never going to hear from, unfortunately. But also, who I think also played an important role in all this was the SoCal Mike's wife, Trisha, because it's because she also plays a central part in all of this. I've always wondered how much did she know about what was going. How much did she know? What was going on? But what was her involvement of all of this? Because it's because I remember. I can talk about this now because I think the statute of limitations on this way expired at this point. But because during those crazy days of early 2016, when the Atari Age forum, a thread I mentioned before, was blowing up, I mentioned in my post there, I'm I asked that same question, what's the wife's involvement in all of this? I mean, how much does she know? How much is she responsible for all this happening? So,
right.
Albert, the owner and moderator of the site, actually yanked the post and sent me a DM, privately, just basically saying he basically said, hey, I agree with you in wanting to know more about this, in her involvement and questioning her role in this. I just don't think it. So I just don't think that this forum is appropriate place. Right. Appropriate place to be asking that. And I'm like, okay, I understand that. So I apologize. So, So even back then I had doubts as to what was going on because the book explains the book does shed a little bit of light on this. It does explain her personality to her personality and her actions to some degree.
Yeah.
So I think Mike was being driven in part at least by Trisha's involvement with this, but yes, it's unfortunate. It's unfortunate that because of the fact they're married, we're probably never going to hear her side of the story either, because so those three people are the people. Those three folks, the people the people I really wish had been directly involved in the project. That said, a lot of good folks were directly involved in the project. Like you had the CU podcast guys. You had like Willie. You obviously had like UK Mike and Scott Shriver.
Yeah.
A lot of people like direct knowledge did contribute to the book, and the books much better because of that.
Yeah.
So,
absolutely.
So unfortunately, this is a tell-all book in as much of a tell-all book that it can be. There's still questions. There's still questions involved. There's still going to be unanswered speculation. There's still going to be, for example, what you and I've already mentioned, what point did this cross the line between like a legitimate project or project a scam?
Right.
There's still a whole bunch of questions and information left unsaid at the end. Not through the book's fault. The book does what it can to explain all this and shed light on this. It's just that it's a very incomplete picture. So it's still a complete history on the whole saga I think we're gonna get. So unless UK Mike, unless SoCal Mike himself or somebody else comes forward with their involvement and knowledge,
right,
we're really not gonna do any better, because this is really as intensive as it can be, because this book's meaty. This book's a good 680 pages, I think, but so I mean, it's not a huge book, but there's like a good amount of knowledge here for what it covers. So I think, like, considering the project, I think UK Mike did a great job with what he could in trying to explain his balance and nuance of picture, as complete a picture as it could.
I think the book set out to do what it was to do. It's UK Mike. He wants you to know that despite everything that happened with the Retro VGS and the Coleco Chameleon and Mike Kennedy, they were friends. It started off as a friendship. Mike Kennedy was, maybe he still is, I don't know. And he kind of leaves that kind of open-ended in the book. Like, Mike Kennedy was a good guy. Was he misled? Absolutely. Are there things that could have been done to bring him back? As we talked about, I believe that there probably could have been, but maybe not. I wasn't there, in the thick of it. I think this book was written, and I was telling you this, off the podcast. I felt like it was like kind of scattered. It was like an info dump and everything else, but it's really, I think this was a therapeutic tool for UK Mike to be able to just air out everything that he had, and everything that he was involved with. Like, it was just one of those, like, it had been built up so much inside, and like only the critics on the internet, which is, forum people, the CU podcast, whatever, they were the only ones, they were the voice. There was no original voice out there to basically say, look, this is what was happening. You've heard this side of the story, but now it's time to hear this side of the story. And I just think that was why the book was really written, and and it really feels that way. I don't hate the book, but I also didn't love the book.
That's fair.
Yeah. I recommend this if you have any interest in the Retro VGS, the Coleco Chameleon, or if you've heard the name Mike Kennedy before and you're just like, who the hell is that guy? This is the book for you, and I highly recommend it.
Right.
But like I said, for me, like I felt like I needed to make a flow chart sometimes to be able to keep track of who UK Mike was talking about, just because sometimes he would mention someone and then they'd be ignored for like 100 pages, and he'd have to like reintroduce them, and that's exactly what he did, was reintroduce them with descriptions and everything else, and it just felt, I mean, I don't want to call him out and say that he was padding the book, but that's what it felt like, you know what I mean? It was a lot of fluff, and it's his first book, and that's one thing that you and I talked about, you know, before we started recording. It's his first book.
As far as I know, it's his first book.
Right. As far as we know. So, you know, he gets a pass. You know, like I said, I didn't love the book, but I also didn't hate it.
Right. Yeah, no, definitely. So, I like the book a bit more than you did, I think, but I definitely agree with you. Like I said before, the book could have really benefited like an index of like a who's who to help spell that stuff straight. So, I also can share a little bit of knowledge about a little bit of knowledge like about the third part of the book as well too. Because the third part of the book is kind of like the summary, the wrap up portion, where it's like they talk about the fallout for what happened. Because of course, before a dumpster fire this big, there's gonna be fallout. There's gonna be big fallout. So, so it talks about what happened afterwards with the whole like, you know, Coleco Holding Group, like in the failed expo that they had, and like, you know, I was involved in Atari Age as well when that was going on too, because Chris Camille, the guy who was involved, we all thought he was a good guy because we all gave him a pass, because he was the one who licensed the Coleco name to Mike Kennedy without knowing what kind of a virus he was attaching the name to. So it's like we all gave him a pass, and like, you know, and then the whole like attacking and then the whole attacking of the fans and the Facebook groups and whatever started. And like, you know, I remember telling the guy, I wrote him a long post, a long response to Atari Age when this was going on because I was active in Atari Age. I'm sorry, he was active in Atari Age too, and I'm like, so I basically just said, dude, you know, I'm an outside observer looking in. I have no interest like in all this. I'm not connected with anybody. I don't have any direct involvement. Involvement. But you know, let me just give you some honest feedback. You're going about so I understand what you're doing. So I understand what you're trying to do. I understand why you're trying to do it, but you're going about this the entirely wrong way. You're blowing up bridges left and right. You're ending your fan base. If you want your expo to be a success, you need to start you need to recognize that, and here's some things you can do. And to his credit, you know, Chris did respond, and he responded in a very polite way. But again, there's shades of Mike Kennedy in the guy, because it's like he'll say one thing, then go about and do something else. So, and we started threatening Albert, the forum website. That's just like, no, that's not going to happen, because you're pissing off the wrong person there at that point, dude. Right. It's like, yeah, because a lot of folks making plans to attend that Coleco Expo. I thought about attending that Coleco Expo myself because New York's not that far of a drive. I mean, you know, like we live in Rhode Island, we could do that.
Yeah, it's like a 6-hour drive, and that would have been fun.
Right. Yeah. But of course, because the whole fallout, the expo was a dismal failure. So, so like, you know, and so the book explains, the book talks about this because this expo is one of many things that happened as fallout because of the whole Coleco Chameleon fiasco. Mm-hmm. So like, you know, and of course, like Scott and UK Mike cut ties with SoCal Mike. They found, like they eventually kicked him off the podcast. Because of the infamous Surf Dogs episode, which I was there. I was in the live feed when that happened. So, I remember all that. Like Mike just mentioned this book, but to say Scott was not happy was an understatement of the year. So. Right. Poor guy. Well, he was also on like 4 hours of sleep, so it's like it's like I don't blame him for being testy, but
Right.
Yeah. So so they found new co-host to take Mike's place, and like I said before, the podcast is still going alive well today. It's still doing very well. I just don't listen to the podcast very much anymore these days because because the main fact, not because it's not a bad podcast anymore, and not because the fact that the hosts that the UK Mike and Scott got are good. I miss that chemistry. Like those three guys had a really amazing chemistry, like I said before. Like, the way that Mike explained everything, the way that Mike contributed the conversation, the top 10 debates, and the segments he did or whatever, it was fun. Without him being on the podcast, the podcast is just not the same thing.
Right.
It's not fair. It's not fair to them. Because like I said before, it's not their fault. They're still doing excellent work. I still listen. I still listen to the podcast occasionally. Just more like I'm very hit or miss now these days in the segments I listen to. Whereas before I used to listen to maybe like 75 to 100% of the podcast. Nowadays like 10-20%.
Yeah.
So because I like but yeah, so it's like the whole thing was just like very unfortunate. So yeah, and like and the book talks about what happened to Mike Kennedy Kennedy afterwards, as far as anybody knows, because the information we have on him, even to this day, is very limited. Because, I did not know some of the stuff that the book said because, so I knew Mike Kennedy poked his head above water briefly in January 2018 to make a post on Atari Age because Atari Age TV saw that post.
Right.
I think I replied to that post. I don't remember now at this point. So. But yeah, since that time he's been totally he's been totally quiet. So I don't blame the guy.
Right.
But at the same time, it's like I did not know he lost his job because of all this. I did not know that he moved to Arizona with his wife because of this. So but yeah, so his life definitely got I don't want to say ruined by this. But it definitely got drastically and severely affected in a negative way because of the fallout from this.
Yeah, I was gonna say it was definitely a hell of a shift.
Yes. So, and it's like did he deserve all that? You can argue. Yes or no. I mean, everybody's gonna have their own opinions about that. I mean, because they the book makes the point that there were problems with the job anyway. So.
Yeah.
He may have lost a job anyway because of this, but having to downsize, losing the house, the boat, to everything else, the condo because of all this, that's definitely a direct effect. His finances taking a hit because of this whole fiasco.
Right.
So, we don't know how he's doing these days. So I hope he's doing okay.
Yeah.
I personally do not wish the guy any ill harm. So
Right.
I mean, I actually would go so far as to say, and this is going to be a very controversial statement. So I would go so far as to say that I actually feel bad sorry for him.
Mm-hmm.
I really do because it's like, yes, he effed up. Yes, he made a lot of mistakes. Yes, it's definitely crossing the scam territory at some point. It's like it's like as the old saying goes, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Right.
So, at some point, he definitely erred. He definitely went to the dark side.
Yeah.
So, that said, I'm a firm believer. That said, I personally am a firm believer in redemption. I personally am a firm believer in second chances.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in Mike Kennedy's case, it would be it would be like fourth chances, but whatever. The point's made. It's like it's like if he someday just resurfaced with maybe like a podcast or like a website or something like that, I would welcome him with open arms because it's like I think the guy I think the guy deserves a chance to be able to redeem himself. You know,
Right.
at the but you know whether or not he actually ever can is debatable. Whether or not he actually ever will is debatable.
Yeah.
You know, just like the whole thing's sad. It's just like you know, just like no matter how you slice it, you know, like maybe nobody else directly got personally affected, financially affected by this. But people definitely personally got affected by this. You know, friendships, friendships were lost, marriages were strained. You know, like, money was spent, personal money.
Right.
You know, so I take back what I just said. But the greatest financial loss was Mike Kennedy himself. But other people did take hits, but they weren't quite as bad as that. So it's like,
Right.
you know, so it's like, I mean, like, I kind of wish that so we had more information, because like I said, you know, I personally do not wish the guy like any ill harm. It's like, like I said before, it's a shame because I remember the. Yeah, because I many people, I remember Mike Kennedy of old. I remember the great charming personal friendly guy he used to be, and I remember how passionate he was about the gaming scene, you know, the retro gaming community. Something happened along the way to corrupt that. Something happened along the way to change all that.
Yeah.
Regardless, you know, I firmly believe it was not the original intention. But something did happen like along the way, and it's like, you know, the book does a great job. The book does a great job of finishing up. You know, like by saying, you know, this is the saga of one man's ego. This is the saga of like a one man's hubris. This is the saga, like, you know, one project that started the best of intentions, going horribly wrong, like in every possible, possible way. So, I mean, like, you know, so yeah, so. You know, maybe one day, when enough time passes, like enough like wounds are healed, and enough like, you know, people are willing to forgive and forget. Maybe he might make an appearance again. I don't know. I certainly hope he does. I think that I think he comes back a changed man and devotes himself toward the retro gaming community like the way he used to do like 10 years ago.
Yeah.
He can be a positive impact for a lot of people, but you know, like, but you know, like, we really don't know. So, and that's the biggest, and so it's one of the biggest questions. It's one of the biggest question marks that this whole book leaves you with. That, and also like just an overwhelming sense of like failure and sadness.
Yeah.
That did, you know, they didn't have to be that way.
Yep. Agreed.
So, you have any final thoughts about the final thoughts about the third part of the book, or anything? Your third part of the book?
No, I think I think what you said encapsulates it perfectly. You know, this ends on a very sad note, and I'm with you. Like, I personally didn't know Mike Kennedy, but you know, after reading the book, I feel like I know the guy. And I think if he resurfaced, which, to be honest, I would not be surprised if this book would cause him to maybe resurface. Maybe not right away, but, you know, down the line, where he writes his own book on what happened. Whether it's going to be 100% factual or not, you know, that's up for debate. But, you know, it's very possible that we get, you know, the true story of, you know, the retro VGS or whatever, you know, that he decides, you know, to pen himself down the line, because, you know, I think with the Kickstarter for this and showing the generated interest in this, that, you know, he's out there, he's seeing everything that's going on, he's just not making noise, you know what I mean? So, you know,
that I have no doubt, doubt like whatsoever.
And if the book is true, with the, you know, him being an opportunist and whatever else, I can definitely see that being a thing. He just needs to go about it the right way this time around. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. No, definitely. Yep, I agree with that totally. And I mean, like UK Mike said the main reason he wanted Kickstarter funds to launch the book was to protect himself against possible like legal actions. I'm sure the legal actions he was worried about. He was worried about like either going to come from Mike Kennedy or from like Sean Robinson.
Right.
So, I've not heard of anything happening. I'm sure Mike would have told us if anything had happened. But
Right.
I totally understand like wanting to get some funds. Yeah, let me hire a lawyer to look over this just in case.
Right,
So.
right. Yeah, you definitely want to protect your own butt when you do something like this and exposing a lot of people.
Oh yeah, because definitely could tell all. Because like,
Yeah.
because like I said, one of the main draws of the project was the insider knowledge.
Yep.
Like like things coming out that never been public knowledge like this point. So, but they yeah, no, I found the book to be very interesting and fascinating to read. So, I had a bit of a time. So, like, so I have a bit of So I had a bit of an easier time understanding this and processing all this than than you did. Maybe it's just because I knew more about this going in. Maybe it's just because you and I are different readers.
Right.
I mean, there could be like there could be like multiple reasons for it. But yeah. So I do agree with you that the book. So I do agree with you that the book could have used an index in the back with like a who's who, people and places.
Yeah.
I do think the first part of the book slogs a bit, like I said before. So. The other criticism I would have with the book is that I'm sure it's problematic for UK Mike writing this book because he was directly involved with many of the direct events that happened at this point, and because of that, I noticed the and so because I noticed the point of view and the context changing every now and then in the book. I mean, there were places where Mike referred to himself in the first person, and there were places where Mike referred to himself in the third person.
Right.
So, I understand it's difficult to be consistent because again, he is personally involved with a lot of this stuff. So it's like I think you should decided like the beginning. I'm gonna present this book as first person. That's first person that is use I the entire book, or present this book or present this entirely third person, just being like I'm just gonna refer to myself as like Mike James the whole book. Instead he tries to do both, and it gets confusing spots because of that.
Yeah.
And there are a couple of like a very small grammar and spelling errors I noticed. Not really like a big deal for like a self-published book. So I'm not gonna I'm certainly not gonna like hold that against the guy. So that's really about it. That's really about it. What I had to say about both the book itself and also criticism about it. The book's currently available on Mike's website for £15 for the digital copy, which is available to you in several formats, so you can read it in your computer or browser or tablet of choice. There's a paperback version of the book planned, coming out soon. That's been delayed because of COVID, of course, but Mike has promised those books are coming at some point. It's definitely very like a good read. I mean, I think you'll get more enjoyment out of it if you were involved with the events being talked about, and if you and if you remember them happening back when they happened. But like I said, I think like Mike Kennedy. I think UK Mike did a great job trying to present Mike Kennedy in a way that a layperson could pick up the book, and understand it, understand by the end of the book like what happened.
Yeah.
So that adds to the complexity and confusion of the book, I think. But he had a choice of how he wanted to write the book, and I think that taking that approach was overall the right choice.
Mm-hmm.
So. Yeah, very good book. I actually tore through the book in like 3 days. So, because well, I mean, I'm a fast reader anyway, but I also found the book to be like very interesting. And I did, whatnot. So, until something, until one of the guys involved decide to come forward with their own version of events, this is probably going to be going to be the definitive tell-all, of the whole saga. So, it's very interesting because, I think you can I think you're gonna learn a lesson from this, because we all probably know somebody. Because we all probably know somebody like Mike Kennedy, like in our lives.
Yeah.
Maybe not to the extent that he was, but we definitely do. But I'm sure most of us know somebody who's like him. I definitely do. You probably do, Joe.
Yep.
So it's like, maybe we can use this book as like knowledge to try to help decide how best to handle that person.
Mm-hmm.
How you want to approach it. It's it's a fascinating study in several ways. I mean, not just from a history perspective, also from psychology and business and social media and whatever. There's a lot of like interesting fables being told and wires being crossed and whatnot throughout the saga of the book. So over relatively. Most of the events of the book happen within like a size 2-year period, so it's like this happened in a relatively short period of time too, to boot.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I think I'm about talked out about the book at this point. Joe, do you have any final thoughts or anything else you want to say and wrap up our summary?
No, I think I kind of spoiled that a little earlier, and I kind of just went off, but like I said, I recommend the book if you have any interest in the retro VGS or Mike Kennedy, or just a passing interest on the retro community in general. This book fits the bill for sure. It was a tough read for me, but also to be fair, Ready Player One is probably one of my favorite books to come out in the last 10 years, and I had to read that 3 times over the course of like 6 months to be able to fully retain that knowledge and everything else, to where I could remember everything without having to pick up the book and reread it. So reading has never been my strong point, and especially taking notes and writing essays on reading is definitely not there for me. So this was a tough one, and as I told you personally off the podcast, I enjoyed this, but at the same time I'm happy to put this behind me.
Yeah, it's definitely a heavy read. I mean, because I would not recommend anybody reading this who doesn't want to take the time or interest in learning more about this, because if you just want like a simple, quick and easy summary, there's plenty of those available on YouTube.
Yeah.
That do a very good job of boiling things down in about 10-15 minutes. Mm-hmm. So this is mostly this book's mostly for people who want to learn more about this in detail. Mm-hmm. So it might have been a little bit unfair to ask you to read this along with me, Joe. So
it's okay.
I do.
And just remember, anytime you ask, I always have the option to say no. And if I don't say no, then I've done it to myself, right?
Yeah. Well, at least in the end, you enjoyed it, like what it was. So,
yeah.
I mean, but yeah. So, all right. Alrighty then. Definitely a fun read. So, and this may be, like I said before, this may be the last step in this in this saga. The saga's been dead and buried for a good 5 years now at this point. Yeah. So, enough times passed. I think people are going to go back and look at this again with curious and interesting eyes. I hope the book's been selling well. Mike hasn't really said any kind of indication of how well that's insane.
Yeah.
He did mention the reviews of the book have been mostly positive. So
yeah.
So that's good. But anyway, so thank you again always for listening to us. We appreciate it. We'll be back next time with a more normal episode on a like in a Super NES game. So what are we covering next time, Joe?
We're going back to the park, Jurassic Park, with The Chaos Continues.
Yes, aka Jurassic Park 2, which is a very different game than the first game. So, but very different game.
Yeah, I felt it was time to visit the sequels. There's been enough air in between.
Oh yeah, for sure. So, but anyway, so if you have any questions, feedback, comments, etc., you can look so you can find us on our Facebook page. You can also send me an email directly to the SNES podcast at yahoo.com. Joe, how can they get a hold of you?
You can find me on Twitter at JOESUX30, and I have a very public Facebook, so I mean, you can find me either way.
Yes, very public and not always and not always like safe for work either. So.
That's true.
But anyway, alrighty. Thanks again as always, and thank you everybody out there for indulging us with this different experimental episode. If you listened this far, we very much appreciate it. Like I said, we went back to our regular scheduled programming the next time, and we have a bunch of guest hosts lined up in the months to come. So I've been teasing it for a while. Yep. So I've been teasing it for a while. It's finally coming together. So like they are coming. So stay tuned. Thank you again as always, and take care, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Nintendo controls 80% of the video market. But no matter how you play the game, or which game you play, things definitely have come a long way since Pac-Man. Now you're playing with power. Super power.